All right. So good evening and good afternoon. Actually, good morning to some of you. I hope all is well. A happy Hanukkah to everybody. I want to give you a little bit of a preview of what we're going to do tonight. Is the goal, I hope. I don't always do that, but I like to try to stay focused on what we're going to do, and just you should know what's happening. I want to finish just kind of like one more minute or two, just finishing up Chassidut. We're going to go into the next part of it, which is the concept of mitnagdim. Talk a little bit about the Admor Hazaken, the Alter Rebbe, Shneur Zalman from Liadi, give a little biographical background. Talk a little bit about the structure of Tanya, if we can get to it, hopefully. And if not, will be next week. And then the introduction to the book is based on a single pasuk. So if we get to that, that'd be great. My guess is we won't, but that's the overarching goal. So, you all over here. Okay. Where we left off last week, we had given some background to leading up to Chassidut. And for those of you who were not here last week and maybe didn't have a chance to see the video since, you can always catch it on YouTube. We started pretty much at the time of the Renaissance and brought ourselves up to the time of the birth of Hasidut and the Baal Shem Tov, also known as the Besht. And just a couple comments about that before we move into their nemesis, in quotes, the mitnagdim. So the Baal Shem Tov, who founded Hasidut, and we talked last week, I'm not going to rehash last week, the foundation or the beginning of Hasidut and what was its goals and its outlook in life. When he died, when the Baal Shem Tov died in 1760, his main Talmud, Rebbe Dov Ber of Mezerich, is the one who took over. And I would say there were three, and I think I mentioned this last week, but there are three main, unique, important individuals to know their names that were from this time period, actually, from the early 1700s to the late 1700s, early 1800s. You had Rebbe Dov Ber, who was the Baal Shem Tov's main Talmud. Is, by the way, interestingly enough, when Carl Jung was nearing the end of his life, he mentioned that pretty much anything he came up with in describing human nature and human psychology, he said that the Rebbe Dov Ber from Mezerich had pretty much already written the book on it almost literally. So that's pretty amazing. Tells you a little bit about who he was. In any case, his student, and we're going to talk a little bit about him, obviously, a little bit more at length, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, also known as the Alter Rebbe, also known as the Admor Hazaken, the Baal HaTanya, who wrote the book that we are going to be starting, Bezrat Hashem. And the next major name that you all would know, and I'll tell you why this is unbelievable hashgacha, is Rabbi Nachman from Breslov. Rabbi Nachman from Breslov was the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, and he died in 1811. You know, sometimes we hear names and we say, like, oh, when did they live? The 12th century. So he's relatively recent, the Rabbi Nachman. Why I say it's hashgacha, I was in Yerushalayim today. I went on a bit of a tiyul, hence the t-shirt still. Went on a tiyul in the Yerushalayim in the Jerusalem forest. First time I've ever been there. Went with my wife, and we were tiyuling around, and we did this beautiful walk, got back to Yerushalayim into the city itself, and then I got on a train to head back to Ma'ale Adumim. And we got to, for those of you know the light rail system, I got to Shifei Yisrael, I think that was, and I said, oh, Mincha, I will not make it back in time to Ma'ale Adumim for Mincha. So I jumped off the train and ran over to Chut Shel Chesed, which is the Breslover headquarters under Rav Shalom Arush Shlita. And not only did I have a chance to literally walk in as they started Mincha, I also had the zechut to stay there while he lit Hanukkah lights. So that was pretty amazing. So that was just in the same day. I'm just to mention Rabbi Nachman from Breslov's name. Now, so we had this whole concept of Chassidut that was infusing joy and life and happiness and music and song. And it was really connecting with the average person in the street. And again, we're talking about it's coming on the heels of a lot of sadness and a lot of pogroms and a lot of bad things. And you had many, many of these people who were attaching themselves to Chassidut were also very uneducated. And potentially they were, I don't want to use the word manipulated because they weren't being manipulated, but they were open to something. And the problem was that you had people, and not just Stam people, that were very, very much opposed the Chassidut, the movement of Chassidut. The most well-known was the Vilna Gaon himself. The Vilna Gaon, the Gra, who passed away in 1797, was violently and vehemently opposed to Chassidut, and he wasn't just stam against it. He had his reasons. Now, to be against them, he and then those people of his group that were against it were called the Mitnagdim, also known as Misnagdim. Hitnagel means to be against something. The Hasidim were not for something, they represented something. It was a movement, it was a belief system, it was a way of growth, it was a way of coming closer to Hashem. And the Vilna Gaon, who was the founder, and we use the word in quotes, obviously, of the Mitnagdim, those who were against them. Why was he against them? Now, this is why I say you cannot learn this time period in the Tanya without putting it in context. And what was the context I want to share with you? If you remember, we were talking last week, we talked about the false Messiah, the false Mashiach, known as the Shabtai Tzvi. There was the Shabtai Tzvi, and I just mentioned B'Shulayim, I mentioned there was also someone named Yaakov Frank, who was also found to be a false Messiah. And what happened as a result of those two individuals who were thought to be Mashiach, and the people were packing their bags in the most literal sense, and then it all falls apart? It brought more dikaon and brought more depression and sadness. So the Vilna Gaon was terrified that the Baal Shem Tov and his followers were nothing more than a flash in the pan. They were just another false Mashiach, that they were going to lead the Jews astray. That was the first main objection he had. He had other objections, and it's important to know what these objections are, because as we go through Tanya, over many, many chapters and months and potentially years, you'll see how some of these ideas that if you didn't know this background, you could maybe come to your mind yourself and say, wait, something's not right here. But then the Alter Rebbe will, in fact, clarify all of his positions. But what was he against? So I mentioned the word Rebbe. So the Vilna Gaon was against this concept of a Rebbe, the spiritual leader of every Hasidic sect. Remember, I said that the Vilna Gaon, the Baal Shem Tov, who founded Hasidut. Then, as time went on, there were different branches, and there's the Tanzers and the Belazers and all these names that you know, and the Chabadnik and the Babich, which we'll talk about. And each one had their spiritual leader. Now, it wasn't like the rabbi of your shul. The Rebbe had taken on a very different connotation, because the belief was that by attaching yourself, then Chassidut, and still, by the way, by attaching yourself to the Rebbe, even if you yourself are not very spiritual, very great in your holiness and in your service of Hashem, but by merely attaching yourself to the Rebbe, you already have a closer connection to Hashem. And we're going to see this in Tanya as well. And he was against this idea. In addition to that, he felt that this putting more emphasis on joy and dancing and singing, and it was taking Jewish scholarship, it was pushing it down. He felt that what was the Hasidut was basically giving birth to was that the Jews would be all heart and no mind. Now, there is an expression that you need to know, and we're going to hear it a few times. If you learn other books like Chovot HaLevavot, and especially if you ever learn the Minchat Chinuch or Sefer HaChinuch, you'll hear this expression, and that is Rachmana Liba Ba'e. It's Aramaic, means Hashem wants your heart. Now we know that, okay? Serving Hashem just with our mind is missing a lot. And we're going to obviously see that over the course of many months. It's a huge part of Tanya, and it's a huge part of all the different books in general about getting closer to Hashem. So yes, Hashem wants our heart, but at the same time, the Vilna Gaon was saying, but he wants your mind. He needs the intellectual. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that all the Hasidut is about joy and dancing and singing and jumping on top of vans and nothing to do with the intellectual part. Of course it is. But he had a perspective that this was going to veer the Jews away from the intellectual and merely be focusing on the mind. He also was very upset that the Hasidim had changed the text of davening. We're not going to get into it tonight. We won't. You can always look online. But the changes that were made in tefillah in the Hasidic world, whether it was Nusach Ari and others, he felt was a serious break with tradition of tefillah. So therefore, because he was against, and his people were against the Hasidim, they became known as the Mitnagdim, or those who are against. To this very day, you will hear people say he's a Chassid, he's a Misnagid, but we're not. Now, keep in mind that the Vilna Gaon in 1772 tried to excommunicate Hasidim across the board. That was the goal. They actually tried to excommunicate them. It didn't stick. It didn't work. But in any case, you will find that even to this very day, there are people who will identify themselves as Hasidim, as Misnagdim, but they're no longer against per se. And Hasidut obviously is well entrenched in Jewish life and well entrenched in day-to-day life of many, many people, where we have this additional layer and multiple layers of ways to serve Hashem. And if you follow and you look at the logic of the Mitnagdim, some of the things that they were against in the 1700s still would apply. But it's not like it was back then. You don't have this vociferous going against Hasidut, because obviously, goes without saying that Dov Ber from Mezerich and Rishon Shneur Zalman Liadi and Rabbi Nachman, they weren't false Mashiach. They didn't claim to be Mashiach. Let's talk a little bit about Rav Shneur Zalman from Liadi, because he is the author of Tanya. We're going to get to that, obviously. We'll see. But we need to know a little bit more background about who he was. He was a direct descendant of the Maharal Prague. And I want to tell you a little bit of background, just a little historical family background with him. His father, Baruch, moved to a city at some point, a city was called Lubavitch, hence the name Lubavitch or Hasidim. For those of you who are familiar with Satmar, by the way, you may be surprised to find out, and I was on a trip once to Israel with somebody whose name I will not mention, and he referred to them as the Saint Mary Hasidim. And we all looked at him like, what are you talking about, Saint Mary? So the original name in Hungary of Satmar is Satu Mare. Satu Mare means Saint Mary. So they called them the Saint Mary Hasidim. But basically, Hasidim will take the name of, usually the name of the original location where the Rebbe is from and where the Hasidut was first formed, the Chatzer it's called. So Shneur Zalman's father was a Baruch, born in city Lubavitch, and that's where Shneur Zalman is born. And he then learns under Rebbe Yisachar Ber of Kobilnik. I can't remember what the official name was. I can't remember. Also lived in Lubavitch. He was as a young man already learning the Talmud. Now, for those of you who learn Gemara, familiar with Gemara, you'll know it's not something you just open, even with Art Scroll and even with Schottenstein and even with back 30, 40 years ago, Sensino, for those of you who remember Sensino. You can't just open up and start learning it. It takes time, and especially for a youngster to learn Gemara, it can be very daunting. Not only was he already, but by the age of 12, already very far knowledgeable of all of Shas, of all of Gemara. He also is thoroughly knowledgeable of studies of mathematics and science, because he believed, as did many of his followers and many people outside the Hasidic world, including, by the way, people like the Vilna Gaon, that in order to be able to read good and understand Torah, you also have to know sciences, math, you have to know astronomy, to really fully understand the Talmud. And we're saying that at a very young age, Shneur Zalman was very well aware, and he's also at that age, at 12 years old, he was already seen as an equal to the greatest scholars in his own city. Now I want you to pause for a second and think about someone that's 12 years old that you know. Put it in perspective, what he accomplished at the age of 12. And he already was seen at 12 as this Eloi, as this genius. The question, of course, can come up, like, understand, you have someone like him, you have somebody else like Rabbi Nachman, you have somebody else like Beri Shchai, who died, I think, was 36 years old. The Arizal died at 39. How in the world did they accomplish so much and get so much Torah in their head and to teach so much at such a young age? And we're going to actually answer that question as we move through the book. Early in the book, actually, this question will be somewhat addressed, and it'll apply to not only the Admor HaZaken, but to many people who would fall in that category. At the age of 20, he was married, he had children already, and he decided that he needed it with his wife's consent. She approved it. Otherwise, he couldn't have done it. He left the home. He left his home and his family, and he went to on a quest. He felt he needed more. He needed a greater religious experience. He needed more teachers. He needed the solitude of his own four walls. He needed to engross himself completely in Torah. And he had two choices at that time period, in the late 1700s, mid 1700s. He had two places to choose from where he would go learn. One was Vilna. Vilna was at that time one of the two main centers of Torah study in Europe, and especially for scholarship in Gemara and Talmud. The other possibility was there was still this youngish Hasidic movement, and the other possibility was Mezerich. He could go to Mezerich, where Rav Dov Ber of Mezerich was living, the Magid, and he was at that point, because after the Baal Shem Tov, was the figurehead of Hasidut. So he realized that he didn't think that going to learn in Vilna, how the Vilna Gaon, obviously, it wasn't for him. He didn't feel that it was what he was searching for. Remember, he's not yet, like when the Chavetz Chaim was born, he wasn't the Chavetz Chaim yet. And when Albert Einstein, Lahavda, was born, he wasn't yet Albert, he was a kid. He was Albert Einstein. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Alvar Zaken, the Alter Rebbe, when he was born, he wasn't the Alter Rebbe yet. He was a young man. But we know who he became. So we have to move that aside and understand where his mind was and how he chose this path. And he chose this path very specifically. He had two possibilities. Again, Vilna to the right, so to speak, and to the left, he can go to the world of Hasidut. And he chose the world of Hasidut. But when he first arrived, he was not encouraged. He thought he would see thousands of disciples of the Magid of Mezerich. It was legendary how this man was such an Ilui, a genius, and how he was bringing people together, and the people, even people who had no education, and he didn't really see a whole lot. And actually, he was about to leave. He was dejected. He felt something was missing there. And when he went to say goodbye to the Magid, to Dov Ber of Mezerich, again, you have to keep in mind that Dov Ber was the Talmid Muvhak, the main student of the Vilna Gaon, of the Baal Shem Tov. When he went to say goodbye, Rav Dov Ber stood there, as the Alter Rebbe describes in some of his writings, boring with his eyes, boring into his soul. And he told him, after a few months of silence, what he was thinking about, what his plans were, how he can grow. In other words, he, in a sense, connected to his neshama, to the neshama of the Admor HaZaken. And from that moment, he was completely subsumed to the life, so to speak, of Dov Ber of Mezerich, in order to learn as much as he could from him. And he absorbed the fundamentals of Hasidut, and his neshama, as he writes many times, was completely, my words, not his, like overwhelmed and completely filled with love of Hashem at that moment. He did something that was radical. Now, writing a book isn't radical, but when you take something that's considered already the classic work, imagine for a moment, I had the chutzpah to take the Rambam's work and say, I'm going to rewrite the Rambam. I'm going to make it more up to date. Okay, who am I? But he was who he was. And at the request of Reb Dov Ber of Mezerich and others, he actually took the Shulchan Aruch, which had been written already about 200 years prior, the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, written again, combined between the Mechaber and the Ramah, and you have Yosef Karo and Reb Moshe Isserles, And he edited and added and made it also bringing in things that were more timely, and rewrote a Shulchan Aruch. And it was called, it's still every Lubavitch home will have it. Every Chabad house is going to have multiple copies. It's called Shulchan Aruch Harav. You'll see it quoted all over. When you go, if you ever go look at anything, look at Dini Halacha, look at modern Sfarim, you will very often see in the footnotes when they quote something, the Shulchan Aruch Harav is quoted. But back then, it was mind-blowing that someone would take the Shulchan Aruch, which for already at that point for 2 centuries had been the code of Jewish law, which today it still is, and say it didn't take things away. God forbid he didn't change the halachot, but he amended, not emended, certain things. Put in what he did in a sense is similar to what Rav Moshe Isserlich did. He added the Ashkenazi opinions to the Sephardi opinion and made the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, and he did so for the Hasidic world. It is the Shulchan Aruch for the Hasidic world. It's a very difficult. Had to been a very difficult task. Interestingly enough, his mentor, Reb Dov Ber from Mezrich, died on Yutet Kislev. The Yutet Kislev I mentioned last week. Actually, I didn't. I mentioned it only in a voice note. I'm going to come back to that. Is a critical date in Hasidut, which I'll mention shortly why. But the same date is that date, in the 19th of Kislev, which just was, is the date which Reb Dov Ber from Mezrich passed away. And at that point, when he passed away, it started to branch up, as I mentioned earlier, into different groups of Hasidim, and each one with their own Rebbe. We'll see in a minute why Yotet Kislev is also very important in not only the Chabad calendar, but in the world of Hasidut. The Alter Rebbe, the Admor HaZaken, was not unaware that the Vilna Gaon was vehemently opposed to the world of Hasidut. He wasn't unaware of it. He actually tried to set up a meeting to meet with him to discuss it. Can you imagine? I would have loved to have been a fly on. They didn't meet because the Vilna Gaon rejected it, very strongly rejected. Said, "I'm not even going to sit with him." But can you imagine if they had sat and talked and there had been a video of that? That would have been an unbelievable discussion between basically the two major figureheads of the two different worlds, the Hasidut and the Mitnagdim. Amazing. Okay, I want to kind of fast forward a little bit. Rosh Zalman was very politically active. I don't mean he ran for office. I don't mean that he sat in the governmental seat, but he was very much involved in the day-to-day lives of the Jews and trying to see to it that Jews would come to it. Also within the Hasidic world, I'm not going to get into it. You can look it up. There were those Hasidim who were in favor of Napoleon and France, and there was those who were more with Tsar and with Russia, and they felt that would be a better card to play. So Rosh Zalman was much more onto the Russian side, of trying to get Jews to come to Russia, to be more in Russia, to leave France, and to take sides in the Napoleonic War, to be more the side of Russia. Parenthetically, I'm a year and a half into reading War and Peace. It'll take me another half a year probably to finish it. But knowing this background too is also pretty interesting. But in any case, as he is working for the Jews, and he's a known entity to the Russian government also, he is developing at the same time, he's working this political part, also growing the philosophy of Chabad. And we're going to see what that stands for in a little bit. He is himself is looked at, of course, as a tzaddik, is looked at as being the leader of the Hasidim, the Lubavitch Hasidim. And he determines this idea that the highest level of serving Hashem is through three things: Chokhmah, Binah, Da'at, which is the initial letters of Chabad: Chokhmah, Binah, and Da'at. I'm not really going to translate the words. They have to do with knowledge and wisdom, but they're terms that you're going to, even if you know what they mean in English, they're going to be Tanya is going to turn those whole terms on their heads, including many other expressions that you may know or words that Tanya will turn on its head and to give it a completely different perspective. In 1798, Rav Shneur Zalman was arrested. He was arrested and taken to the capital in St. Petersburg. There were trumped up charges that he was trying to go against the government, but thankfully, Tsar Paul I had mercy on him and felt that whatever the stories that were being told were not true. And on Yud Tet Kislev, the 19th of Kislev, he was imprisoned before that, and he was released on the 19th of Kislev. As a result of him being released on the 19th of Kislev, that became known in the world, in the Hasidic world, as the Rosh Hashanah l'Chasidut. It is considered the Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the calendar year, in quotes, of the world of Chasidut, also called Rosh Hashanah l'Geula. It's celebrated like a Chag, obviously not a work Chag that you still can work, but it is considered a very important date in Chasidut. Now, for those of you who didn't hear my voice note last week after our first meeting, I want to repeat something because I forgot to say it during the actual class, and I think it's worth saying again. Those of you who've been with me over the last couple of years, especially a year and a half, you've known I said, okay, I'm going to teach Tanya, I'm going to teach Tanya, I'm going to teach Tanya. And about 2 months ago, I chose a date, which I didn't make public immediately, the date I'm going to start teaching Tanya. I looked at the calendar. I said, okay, it's going to be whatever a week ago last night was, the 23rd of November. And I wrote it down. And I sent out the message and everything. And I didn't realize that day of the 23rd, last week, was Yud Tet Kislev, specifically this important date. So I mentioned it to somebody at school, like everything's hashgacha, and it's unbelievable. And she said, it's actually even more hashgacha, because when did you actually start teaching it? I said, well, I started teaching it actually at night when it was the 20th of Kislev. So she said, that's even more hashgacha. Said, because the 19th of Kislev actually fell on Shabbat. So the Rebbe didn't actually leave jail until the 20th of Kislev. So when we started learning it last week, everything's preordained from God. We started learning it exactly on the 20th of Kislev when this whole event occurred in 1798. So that's pretty interesting. So that's a little bit about Reb Shneir Zalman. I think it's important to know this kind of history, to know about him, to know about the author of the book that we were talking about. But what exactly is Tanya? I want to spend a few minutes on that. Also, where does the name come from? What's the structure of the book? How did he come to write it? What was he thinking and how he did it? So first, before anything, I want to tell you a story I heard now at least 8 or 10 times in the last year. Same story. But whether I heard it from my teacher, who I learned it Tanya from, or I heard it from other Chabadnikim or others, and it really, I think, is a good way to introduce the Admor Hazaken. By the way, for those who are not sure, Admor, Aleph, Dalet, Mem, Vav, Resh, is an acronym. Adonenu, Moreinu, V'Rabbeinu. Okay, it's an Admor is different than let's just say that the Admor is in the Hasidic world is the tzaddik. He's the leader of the sect. Sometimes it's used loosely for others you just want to give an honorific to. So the Admor Hazaken was writing Tanya. He was in the middle of writing his book. And he was sitting at his desk with, I'm assuming, a pen of some sort in his hand, a quill, and just thinking. And his brother walked in. So his brother's brother-in-law, I have to take a look, walked in and watched what he was doing. He was just sitting there. We assumed he was just contemplating something. So he finally asked him, what is it you're doing? He said, I'm trying to determine if the next word I'm going to write needs a vav before it or not. The vav meaning the word and. So for example, I could say, go to the store, please, and buy me some eggs, cheese, and wine. Or I could say, please go to the store and buy me some eggs and cheese and wine. He was trying to determine not only if the vav belonged there, but also when he put the vav, he needed to make sure to start in his head all over from the beginning of the book to determine if it went with the flow of the book, if the word and belonged there or not. That is how medayek, how punctilious and careful he was with every single word and literally every single letter he wrote in time. So let's talk a little bit about the book itself. It has 3 basic names. One, it's called Likutei Amarim, which means it's a collection of, I guess, discourses or sayings. When it first came out, it didn't even have the name of the author. It was published anonymously. And not only was it anonymous, and eventually his name was on it, I think 1796 is the first time it was published with his name on it, I think. By saying it's a Likutei Amarim, and we're going to see the title page possibly in a couple minutes, he's really saying, look, I'm a malaket. What's a malaket? I take a little from here, I take a little from here, and I put it together for you. I have nothing original here. He doesn't say it like that, but I don't have anything. It's just, I'm just taking other sources. Now, I thought about a project many years ago, and something similar has been done. But many, many years ago, I thought about, for those of you learning Gemara, you'll know that if you take a page of Gemara, that very often on the same page, you'll have 10, 12 psukim quoted, and you'll have other sources quoted in the margin. And then, of course, there's the Torah or when it quotes, like, what's the Rambam say and where the sources in the Shulchan Aruch, is to have a sefer that goes page by page of Gemara, that all those sources are written out. So if I were to do something like that, right? Let's say Brachot Daf Bet Amud Aleph, and it has like all the psukim that are quoted there, Vayer Vayivoker, and talks about all these things in the Rambam's commentary on the side, not comments, but the sources. And I would do that. You can't call me a genius. You can't call me, wow, look at that unbelievable author, because I did nothing but take information that's there, combine it, and put it together in a page that will then assist someone learning the page of Gemara. It doesn't take a genius to do something like that. Lahavdil, by calling it Likutei Amarim, the Alter Rebbe, the Mara Zaken, was being exceedingly humble, and saying he just took other sources. Parenthetically, I'm sure some of you learned this at some point in your lives. When Rashi first wrote his commentary on Chumash, he wrote his commentary and would leave little notebooks on his teacher's desk with his comments. No name, just wrote it. By the way, it's why Rashi is known, and when people refer to Rashi, especially Tosfot, the commentaries on Rashi and Gemara, and very often those were his grandchildren, his grandsons, they refer to him as kuntres. Kuntres is a word meaning notebook, because he used to leave his notebooks anonymously, no name attached to it. So unfortunately, or I guess I'm going to look at the positive. Fortunately, we have people in our Jewish history who can teach us a tremendous lesson in humility. Unfortunately, it's something that doesn't exist a lot around a lot of people, but humility is an important aspect when it comes to Torah, because when a person wants to ingratiate themselves to others because of the amount of Torah they've learned, they're going against something it says in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot anyways. So let's go. What's the next possible name for the book? Is Tanya, which is mostly known as, and that's the opening word of the book. We will get to it. And the next is the subtitle of the book is Sefer Shel Beinonim, or Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book of the Beinonim. So what's a Beinoni? That's basically what the whole book will be about. We know three terms: Tzaddik, Beinoni, and Rasha. Translated loosely, the tzaddik is the pious one, the Benoni is the average one, and the Rasha is the evil one. And many of you probably have a preconceived notion, and rightfully so, from the things you've learned over the years, that you generally say, you divide it like this: the tzaddik has more mitzvot than averot, the Rasha has more averot than mitzvot, and the Benoni is exactly in the middle. Okay, we're going to be dealing with that very early in the book and why that doesn't work in the words of the Gemara Zaken. The original writing of the book was very hard to learn because it was written with almost no punctuation, no nikudot. So sometimes the words were unintelligible to some people. Now remember that I'm talking that he's writing this book. It's meant for the masses, and many of those masses are uneducated. So how does that work? We are not going to learn the introduction to the book. We will learn what's called the I forgot what the word in English is, but anyways, the page that has the name, the title of the book, I guess the title page, the title of the book, and it's like the script under that. We're going to learn that, but not the actual introduction. But in his introduction, he discusses the fact that one of the things that was unique to Chassidut was something called Yechidus, What's yechidus? It means spending time alone with the Rebbe. And when you're time alone with the Rebbe, you would ask for advice and guidance and get spiritual counseling, but his followers were growing to such numbers he couldn't do it anymore. So he felt he needed to have a book. And in this book, he would try to answer all the questions that someone could potentially have as far as religion, as far as spirituality, as far as growth and coming closer to Hashem, and reduce the amount of people to come to see him. And he then said that people within the movement who were able to understand, to then teach his word, were then to then teach it to those who couldn't understand. Trust me, I'm not one of those people. I'm not a Chabadnik, and I've told you that. This is just an unbelievable sefer. We all have to, everyone should learn, I believe. But people within the Chabad world who have studied his every single comma and every period and every word he writes, do have this mission from the Admar Zaken to teach Chabad Chassidut to those who don't know it or couldn't learn it to begin with. So it wasn't very easy for the average person to learn, and therefore he encourages those who do understand it. He didn't make it unintelligible, not by a long shot. It's definitely intelligible, but it needed to have background to understand some of the sources. I'll give you an example, not from his book, from something else. Some of you are familiar with the commentary, the Meshech Chochma. The Meshech Chochma, there's Simcha Dvinsk. He writes a commentary on Torah. In order to understand most of the time what he's saying, you have to understand the sources he refers to as if you already know all he's talking about. So if you don't have an annotated Meshech Chochma, it's very hard to understand what he's saying. And in a similar fashion, but not complete, some of the information that he teaches within Tanya, you also have to know what he's referring to. It took him 20 years approximately to write the book. And the world of Chassidut looks at the book of Tanya as being Torah shebichtav. Now, chas v'shalom to say that it replaces Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, but it's in quotes that there's a Torah shebichtav is Tanya, and the Torah shebal peh is the learning of Tanya. God forbid to say it replaces Torah. Chas v'shalom, that's not what it's meant at all, but it's an expression that there's a Torah shebichtav is Tanya, and Torah shebal peh is learning it on a daily basis. I'm sure many of you know that Chabadnikim have and you can look at any version of Tanya, you almost always see in the margin a date. You'll learn this date, you learn this today, you learn this today, learn this day. They learn it every day. And it's essentially a work of, let's say, religious ethics. It deals with forces of good and evil within the person, deals with forces of good and evil in their human nature, in the world, how we reconcile those two opposing forces. And his audience, as I mentioned, ranged from very scholarly individuals, maybe perplexed scholarly individuals, to the simple layman. And because of the wide range of audience he had to make sure he tailored it in a certain way. He couldn't make it too lofty. He couldn't make it too low, because then the people who had a greater brain would have like, okay, well, I know all this stuff. He bases his writings on many things. First and foremost is the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and his student of Dov Ber from Mezerich. I mentioned last week that the Baal Shem Tov never wrote anything. Everything that was written in his name was written in his name, never by him. Also, the Zohar, Tikkunei Zohar, and don't worry, no, you're not going to have to be worried about learning about the 10 Sfirot and all these, the pictures that you may have in your mind as soon as I mention the Zohar, but we will talk about the topic, but you don't need to worry about that. He also drew a lot on Chovot HaLevavot, by Bachya ibn Pakuda, the duties of the heart. Some of you are familiar with this. Rabbi Yosef Albo's The Ikarim, which is one of the first philosophical books in Jewish world. And for those of you who just finished with me a couple months ago, Kuzari, he was a very big fan of the Kuzari. He loved the Kuzari, and he also took some of the ideas that he has and from the Kuzari. Tov. What I want to do is like this. I'm gonna next week, Bezrat Hashem, we're going to look at the title page of the Kuzari of Tanya, But before we do that, I want to share with you one pasuk. Put it up on the screen. It would help if I shared my screen with you. Share screen. Okay. And share. Okay. I want to take a look at one pasuk. This pasuk, and we'll see this next week, Bezrat Hashem, in the title page of the book, forms the basis of the entire book of Tanya. Now, one thing I didn't tell you is Tanya is actually the first of multiple volumes that he wrote. There's Tanya, there's we'll get to it. I'll talk about maybe for 2 minutes next week. This is the pasuk. This is a pasuk in Dvarim that talks about Torah, mitzvot. If I were to ask you, to be honest, this is a rhetorical question that you answer yourself. I guess that's not a rhetorical question then, but it's a question you should only answer to yourself in your head. How easy is it to keep Torah mitzvot? I think there'll be different answers. There'll be different answers for different people. It'll also be different when a person came to being shomer Torah mitzvot in their lives. How easy or how difficult? You know, there's the old Yiddish expression that schwer zu sein a Yid. It's difficult to be Jewish. Doesn't mean because there's so many mitzvot. It means because the pogroms and all these other things. And sometimes people do mean it because, oh, look how many mitzvot we have. The Gemara discusses the idea that there are different nevi'im that were able to distill all of Torah down to X amount of psukim, down to 10 psukim, down to one pasuk. This isn't that pasuk. But there's this idea of we need to wrap our heads around the fact that just so much to do. From the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, our lives revolve around being shomer Torah and mitzvah. And by doing so, we have to always have in mind, are we following Hashem's way or not? It sounds like a very big ask. It's a really big task. And the Torah tells us the following pasuk. Ki karov elecha hadavar me'od. This thing, what's this thing? This idea of keeping Torah mitzvot is very accessible. The word I'm going to use for karov, which means karov means close, I'm going to use the word accessible. Is not only is accessible, it's accessible to you. It's this thing, me'od, very accessible. In what way? Beficha, in your mouth, uvilvavacha, in your heart, la asoto, to do it. Now, I would just want to make this comment that we have here peh, the mouth, lev, the heart, and then la'asot. Okay, just keep that in mind. We're gonna revisit those three words next week. But this entire pasuk, is going to be his understanding of this pasuk is 53 chapters of the book of Tanya. How in the world, for example, can the Torah say that it is accessible? Is okay, I can believe that, but it's me'od. It's extremely accessible. I mean, you think about it. I don't know if that's, I mean, on the surface, it doesn't seem that's extremely, you got to do a lot of work for this. Like, it's like, oh, it's as easy as sticking your hand out and getting mun in the morning in the time of when you're in the desert. No. So what does that mean? It's exceedingly accessible. What does it mean? Just say, that should be the end of the pasuk. What is beficha? Bilvavcha, lasoto. We're going to discuss that starting next week. Bezrat Hashem. In the meantime, I sent out a link today, and I'll use a screen share next week if you don't open the link. Of the title page of the book, which we'll start with, and then going to the beginning of the first parak. So even if you don't have the book, you don't have the link, you didn't open the link, I'll have it on the screen next week. Bezrat Hashem. In the meantime, I will hopefully see everyone next week for Tanya. Those who are Mesilat Yesharim class, see you tomorrow. Those who are Navi class, see you Sunday night, Bezrat Hashem. And if you need to have any questions, please send me messages. Have a wonderful evening, everybody, and Chanukah Sameach.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.